The Supreme Court Thursday upheld a newly drawn South Carolina congressional district map, reversing a lower court decision that had struck it down, saying the map was unconstitutional due to racial gerrymandering. The court ruled in a 6-3 decision that partisan politics, not race, along with a population boom in coastal areas, explain the congressional map. The justice's ruling will have no immediate impact in South Carolina, but it sets up how future redistricting efforts might go. And it's a blow to Democrats who had hoped to secure a more favorable map. Joining me now is The Hill's Zach Schoenfeld. Zach, similar disputes over voting lines are playing out in Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida. How much of a roadmap will this ruling here be for redistricting going forward?
It will have impacts in some of those cases proceeding across the country. It'll have impacts in some states more than others because some of these cases are proceeding under different legal tools. Some of the states that you just listed there, those cases are being brought under the Voting Rights Act, a separate tool from the case at the Supreme Court that they ruled on Thursday, where we're talking about a challenge actually brought under the U.S. Constitution itself. But for some of those cases that are proceeding under the same legal tool, it certainly appears that this decision will make it harder for plaintiffs to prevail.
Now, this particular decision was clearly a victory for Republicans, leading to a map that is favorable to the GOP. But does it also raise the bar for determining when a map can be considered a racial gerrymander rather than a partisan one?
It certainly appears that way. We'll have to see how, this decision eventually impacts some of those other cases because these cases are so fact specific. And so it's going to have to play out state by state. But it generally is going to make it more difficult for some of these plaintiffs to attempt to disentangle race from politics. Because if, lawmakers like the South Carolina Republican lawmakers did here, they can put up a defense saying that this is just a partisan gerrymander because the Supreme Court has said that federal courts have no role to step in and strike down a map for being a partisan gerrymander. So lawmakers can do what South Carolina did here and say that, we moved these, tens of thousands of Black Charleston County voters out, not for along racial lines, but their defense was that it was for partisan reasons to boost Rep. Nancy Mace's district. And so they say that race just was not the motivating factor here.
And we know now Mace is in office there in that congressional district. Now, Zach, how are civil rights groups reacting to this decision?
Just before we started speaking, both the plaintiffs in this case as well as the lawyers who were arguing this on their behalf just addressed reporters, and they were largely attacking this ruling, saying that this was a step back for voting rights. Also, the actual voter, who is the plaintiff in this case that the NAACP and the ACLU has been representing, he called the ruling very, very disturbing.
Zach, this case was argued all the way back in the beginning of the Supreme Court's term in October. Why did the Supreme Court wait so long to rule on this map when this year's elections were fast approaching?
There was a request for them to rule earlier. There were requests for them to rule by January 1st. The idea there was there would need to be time in order for, if they needed to come up with some new map, if the Supreme Court had struck down this map, there would need to be, some process to actually implement a map in time before this year's elections. They had ignored those requests. And obviously, now we are sitting here at the end of May and they have just ruled. So, even if the Supreme Court had went the other way in this decision and had struck down the map, a lower court had actually already had to step in and say it's just gotten too close to 2024. So this map, no matter what the Supreme Court did, was going to be in place this year. But now what the Supreme Court's decision has the effect of is likely allowing Republicans to hold on to this district, not just for this year, but for the rest of the decade.
And this Supreme Court ruling is certainly going to have an impact. Thank you so much, Zach.
Good to be with you.
House Speaker Mike Johnson is boxing in Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer over Israel. Johnson wants to move ahead with his plans to invite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address a joint meeting of Congress. And Majority Leader Chuck Schumer himself is feeling pressure from Johnson to sign the invitation to host the Israeli leader at the Capitol. Joining me now is The Hill's White House correspondent, Alex Gangitano. Alex, I want to get right into it. Speaker Mike Johnson will likely invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to address Congress. It all comes a week after Majority Leader Chuck Schumer harshly criticized Netanyahu on the Senate floor. Talk about the growing divide in Congress when it comes to relations with Israel. Is the White House weighing in?
Yeah, there's definitely this growing divide, as you mentioned, with Republicans firmly standing behind Netanyahu and Democrats like Schumer and also more progressive Democrats being really resilient towards any support towards Netanyahu at this point and backing further and further away from him. The White House at this point has continued their support for Netanyahu, but they're also not really trying to weigh into the divide in Congress right now. When the White House was asked about the prime minister delivering an address, they kind of dodged the question this week. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that, the president and top officials continue to be in touch with Netanyahu and his people, but they're kind of just waiting to see at this point what happens in terms of him coming to Congress.
Also, when it comes to Congress, the bipartisan border security bill heads to the Senate floor once again Thursday for a vote. You'll recall it was blocked by Republicans last time around at the urging of Donald Trump. What is the Biden administration's stance on this?
Yeah, so they've been using the fact that Donald Trump urged them to block this bill and Republicans backed away from this bipartisan legislation. It's really a talking point against Republicans to try to say, hey, we're the ones that want to do something on the border as, a way to turn the tables come November, because Republicans have been so hard on Biden about the influx of migrants at the border. So in terms of this bill coming up on Thursday, the White House is making an effort to really push Republicans once again to back it, but also trying to make it into an argument of, are Republicans either on the side of playing politics or on the side of saving lives, like stopping the influx of fentanyl from coming into the U.S. They're mentioning that this bill will highlight that, or will fund machines to detect fentanyl in vehicles that are crossing the border, and they would provide funding to hire new law enforcement personnel at the border. So they're really pushing what's actually in the bill in order to use it as a talking point. So if this bill does fail, Democrats in the White House can still say, these are the things that we're for, and we tried to get it passed.
Reversal in the 2024 election. Nikki Haley, once a fierce critic and rival of Donald Trump, had this to say earlier this week.
Biden has been a catastrophe. So I will be voting for Trump.
How surprising is this move by Haley? Why is she making this endorsement now?
Yeah, it's definitely surprising considering that Haley was so negative on Trump throughout the presidential primary. She, definitely made herself into the anti-Trump candidate and somebody who, if you were looking for something different this election, she was your person. She did pretty well in some of these primary races as kind of a protest vote against Trump. And now here she is saying that she's going to vote for him over Biden. At the end of the day, she is a Republican. At the end of the day, she also ran for president to, largely unseat Biden at the end because she thinks his presidency isn't going, well, or the country deserves better. But at this point in the election, the Biden campaign has been really trying to court Haley voters and say, if you're a moderate, if you're an independent, if you're someone who's disillusioned by your choices come November, join our camp. But here she is, saying, I'm not even joining your camp. And so I think a lot of her supporters will follow her to the Trump camp too, or not find a home come November and stay home. So we'll see how influential her backing is. But the timing is definitely significant because it gives people months now to figure out what camp they want to fit into.
And also those Haley donors, will see if they go over to Trump. Now, Trump has yet to address Haley supporters, but he is back on the trail and is headed to the Bronx. Trump claims he can turn New York from blue to red. What's his campaign strategy here? What exactly does he think he can get out of this particular trip?
Yeah, this is a rare rally. As you mentioned, New York is so blue, and he's going to a place where Biden blew him out of the water in the 2020 race. He's also recently visited other true blue places like Minnesota and New Jersey. And I think he's showing that he can be competitive in these blue states. And I think something about this strategy is he's not necessarily expecting to actually flip a place like New York or Minnesota or New Jersey. But I think he's trying to, which would be a huge uphill battle for the former president, but I think he's trying to show that his supporters are everywhere and that he can get out out a huge crowd in a place like the Bronx. And it doesn't matter where he is, his supporters will come see him and turn out. And so I think that's just the point that the former president's trying to prove here. And, if he can turn out huge crowds in somewhere like the Bronx, that is worrisome for the Biden campaign because it shows that, he stretches beyond just the ruby red states.
Now, Trump did successfully raise more campaign cash than President Biden last month. How are Democrats reacting to Trump's fundraising?
That's right. So Biden raised $76 million. Trump raised $76 million last month compared to Biden's $51 million. What I'm hearing so far is that Democrats are largely brushing this off, though, noting that the president still has a cash on hand advantage over former President Trump. They're also pointing to the Biden campaign might have a better campaign infrastructure. They have more staff. They have more people on the ground. Well, Trump has also these legal fees that he has to pay out. So it remains to be seen if Trump can actually close the gap here in terms of cash on hand and, continue to outraise him on a month-to-month basis, or if this is just a one-time thing. But, so far, Democrats are really trying to come across with an optimistic outlook that this was a one-time thing and that they have the fundraising edge over the former president.
Alex, let's turn to the growing flag controversy surrounding Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. A flag carried by rioters on January 6th was seen flying outside one of Alito's homes. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries had this to say.
In the case of Samuel Alito, he definitively needs to recuse himself from any matter pending before the United States Supreme Court that has to do with the January 6th violent insurrection.
So there are mounting calls for his removal. You heard it there. But is there anything lawmakers can do, Alex, to try and force Alito to recuse himself?
Yeah, so at this point, the only recourse that they can do if he refuses to recuse himself is impeachment. Congress can move to impeach a Supreme Court justice, a House impeachment, and then a conviction in the Senate, which would require 2/3 votes. It's a very extreme measure. We did hear from Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin this week, who said that, we're not looking at impeachment here. We don't plan to open up an inquiry into Alito, but that Alito does need to, really take a look at if he should be a part of this decision making in the Supreme Court cases against, Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And I think there's just mounting pressure on him to recuse himself. But at this point, it seems like Democrats are not, expected to take that next extreme steps towards impeachment.
Alex, Biden announced Wednesday he will cancel student debt for more than 160,000 borrowers. How much of this loan forgiveness plan is about winning over a younger voting bloc?
It's a good question. So when Biden ran in 2020, student loan forgiveness was a campaign promise of his. He wasn't going as extreme at the time as some progressives who ran against him for the Democratic nomination, who wanted to forgive even more money. But he was saying that, student loan borrowers deserve some forgiveness. And so now that he, wasn't able to get his huge student loan plan passed because the Supreme Court blocked it, he's looking at these, small kind of chunks of ways to help out Americans who are facing student loan debt. So this is just another example of that. So far, his total relief from his student loan debt actions has been $167 billion for 4.75 million Americans. So these are pretty big numbers. And I think this is an effort to appeal to a lot of Americans who feel like student loan debt, in this economy isn't fair. And, they've been looking for some sort of reprieve from it, especially young Americans. Biden has had an enthusiasm issue with young Americans. A lot of Americans aren't excited about November's election. They're not, rallying behind them in the way that young Americans have with other Democratic presidents. So in years prior. So I think the president's really trying to give a boost wherever he can to his support amongst that voting bloc. And student loans is a very clear, effort that he can say, this is this gift to you. I made this promise and I'm trying my best to fulfill it.
Lastly, Alex, the House Wednesday passed the first major piece of legislation to tighten regulation on the cryptocurrency industry. Crypto, which is not so long ago was on the outs with Washington, is garnering bipartisan interest. Yet the SEC says it actually would create regulatory gaps. Where is the administration on this? Will the bill move in the Senate?
Yeah, so 71 Democrats joined the Republicans to vote for it. So, the Senate could garner some support from Democrats as well at this point. But the administration does oppose the bill. They're saying that in its current form, it lacks sufficient protections for consumers and investors who engage in these, digital asset transactions. And meanwhile, the administration is saying we don't support this bill in this form, we still want Congress to develop legislation for digital assets that will set up things like guardrails for consumers, but also allow innovation. So they're trying to see this dual purpose, but they just don't like the way that this bill at this point is written, but they're definitely leaving the door open to another crypto-related legislation.
So maybe later next year. Thanks so much, Alex, for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
A former Democratic political consultant was indicted this week after admitting to sending a robocall with a deepfake of President Biden's voice. That voice, generated by artificial intelligence, was used in calls ahead of the New Hampshire primary. It encouraged voters to stay home and not cast their votes. Steve Kramer has been charged with bribery, intimidation, and suppression, and he's been fined $6 million by the FCC. Kramer told NBC News earlier this year that with a mere $500 investment, anyone could replicate this type of AI-generated voice. The FCC banned the use of AI in robocalls earlier this year after Kramer's effort in New Hampshire. In a move called unprecedented by the Harvard Crimson, Harvard University's governing board will not allow a group of 13 students who participated in pro-Palestine protests to graduate or receive their degrees. The board rejected an effort from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Wednesday to allow the students to graduate. The move underscores tensions between school administrators and faculty amid the rising tide of mass pro-Palestine protests on campuses nationwide. The board says the 13 students could be given their degrees once disciplinary cases go through the standard university protocols, dependent on the results. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.